Sorry, wrong floor, Grandma. Maybe the parking garage is more your speed. Sylvia Tran did not look up from her clipboard. The loading dock behind St. Clement's General had a way of collecting cold, and she had learned long ago to let certain words blow through her the way November wind moves through a chain-link fence. Present, then gone, leaving nothing behind. She checked the next item on her sheet. 2 pallets of surgical drapes, 3rd floor. She made a small mark and moved on. The man who had spoken was Drew Langford, and he said it loud enough for the other residents to hear. That part was deliberate. Drew Langford did everything loud enough for someone to hear. He was 31 years old, 2nd year of his surgical residency, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone whose father's name appeared above 3 hospital wings. His hands were still clean from a morning of nothing. He would scrub them dramatic and slow before rounds anyway. He liked the ritual of looking prepared. Sylvia was 62 and she wore a gray facilities vest with her name ironed on a white patch over the left pocket. She had worn some version of that vest for 11 years at St. Clement's. She knew which elevator ran slow on cold mornings. She knew which OR suite had a thermostat that drifted 2 degrees warmer than the display claimed. She knew the name of every housekeeping staff member on every shift, and she brought Tim Hortons to the overnight crew on the last Friday of every month because she remembered what those Fridays felt like. What she did not carry was a pager, or a title, or anything that made Drew Langford look at her as a person rather than an obstacle in the hallway. The other residents laughed, which was all Drew needed. He was already moving toward the elevator before the sound finished. Sylvia made her mark and kept moving. The thing about St. Clement's was that it ran on 2 separate tracks. There was the hospital people saw when they looked, the atrium with the donor wall, the new imaging wing, the residents in their clean coats, doing confident things. And then there was the hospital that actually functioned. The one that required somebody to know on any given Tuesday that the autoclave in sub-basement 2 had a 30-second delay before the seal confirmed, that the supply elevator had a dead zone on the 4th floor where the call button needed to be held, not pressed, that the overnight pharmacist kept the real controlled substances log in the 2nd drawer, not the 1st, because the 1st drawer stuck in humidity. Sylvia Tran knew all of it. She had learned it the way a person learns a second language, slowly, then permanently, until she stopped noticing she was translating. She had come to facilities work sideways, the way most people come to the thing they end up being best at. 15 years ago, she had been a senior project director at a health systems consulting firm in Vancouver, the kind of job that came with a corner office and a parking spot with her name on a sign. She had spent 12 years redesigning aspirinal flow in hospitals across 4 provinces. She had written the framework that 2 hospital networks still used for interdepartmental logistics. She had testified before a provincial health committee about supply chain restructuring in understaffed facilities. Then her daughter, Lena, had been diagnosed at 34 with an autoimmune condition that required consistent specialist care in one city. Lena's husband worked in Edmonton. The grandchildren were in Edmonton. Sylvia had packed her office in Vancouver on a Wednesday, called the moving company on Thursday, and arrived in Edmonton on a Saturday with 2 suitcases and a very clear sense of what mattered. The consulting work dried up in the transition. She was 60, overqualified in ways that made hiring managers uncomfortable, and unwilling to travel for the 6-month contracts that were all the market offered. A friend mentioned St. Clement's was hiring in facilities coordination. Sylvia had taken the interview on a Monday and started on a Thursday. She did not explain her resume to anyone. People who needed to perform their credentials usually didn't have as many as they claimed. She had found, at 60, that quiet competence was a more efficient use of energy than loud qualification. The facilities department ran out of a basement office that smelled faintly of industrial soap and printer toner. Sylvia shared the space with three other coordinators, a scheduling board that was always 3 days behind, and a man named Ted Kapoor who had worked at St. Clement's for 22 years and knew which board members were afraid of him, which was most of them, and why, which was complicated. Ted watched Sylvia for her first 3 weeks and said nothing except good morning and pass me that pen. In her fourth week, a supply crisis hit the surgical floor. A miscommunication between two departments had left the post-op unit short on a specific grade of wound closure strips with a complex case scheduled in 6 hours. The nursing coordinator was cycling through approval chains. The procurement manager was in a meeting. The resident on the floor, who happened to be Drew Langford, had already filed a complaint with hospital administration about facilities' incompetence, carbon copied to his father's assistant. Sylvia had walked into the supply room, made 2 phone calls and sent 1 email, and had the correct product staged at the OR doors 40 minutes later through a vendor relationship she had maintained since her consulting years. The surgical team never knew there had been a problem. Ted had looked at her across the office when she came back. He handed her a coffee and said, "How long were you going to wait before doing that?" She had thought about it. "Not long," she said. He nodded like she'd confirmed something he already suspected and went back to his scheduling board. Drew Langford did not connect those two events. He was not the kind of person who tracked the outcomes of problems he had already complained about. He had filed the complaint, assigned the failure, and moved forward. The complaint was on record. That was what mattered. His father, Raymond Langford, sat on St. Clement's Foundation Board and had recently committed a significant gift toward the new surgical training center. The center would carry the Langford name. This was known. It shaped the air in certain rooms. The residency director, Dr. Constance Whitmore, had a way of looking past Drew's sharper moments, the way you look past a smudge on a window when the view outside is worth preserving. She was not a cruel woman. She was a practical one. Practical women in positions like hers had learned to price things in units of institutional survival. And the Langford gift was a number that changed certain calculations. The nurses had a different word for Drew. Most of them had it, but only 2 said it out loud, and only in the break room, and only after checking the door. Brenna Calloway had worked surgical nursing at St. Clement's for 19 years. She had started when the building was half its current size, and she had outlasted 4 department heads and 2 renovation cycles and 1 incident involving a gas line that nobody talked about anymore. She was 51, compact, and moved through the hospital with the practiced efficiency of a person who had a long time ago decided that speed and precision were more respectful to patients than performance. Brenna liked Sylvia. She had liked her since the 3rd week, when Sylvia had noticed a medication cart left unsecured near the visitor's elevator and quietly returned it to the nursing station, without making a report, without making a production, without making anyone feel surveilled. She had just fixed it and kept walking. That's how you spot the real ones, Brenna told the break room later. They fix things that aren't their job and they don't want credit for it. The supply crisis had not been the last time Sylvia had quietly prevented a failure. It was the 4th time that month. The others had involved a ventilation irregularity in the immunocompromised ward that facilities had flagged, and Sylvia had quietly escalated through the right channel before it became a health and safety violation. A scheduling error in the sterile processing unit that would have cascaded into a morning of canceled procedures. And a billing dispute with a biomedical maintenance contractor that nobody else had time to read carefully, and that Sylvia had resolved in 40 minutes by reading the original contract language. She had done all of it without being asked and without filing a report about doing it. She fixed things and kept moving. By October, Ted Kapoor had quietly arranged for her to sit in on the operational integration meetings where facilities, nursing, and clinical management tried to align their quarterly workflows. She sat in the back. She said almost nothing, When she spoke, she said it in one sentence, and the sentence was usually the only one in the meeting that described the problem the way the problem actually was. Drew noticed her at one of those meetings in the way people notice furniture, as an obstruction to be noted and dismissed. When the nursing director mentioned a persistent delay in post-surgical supply retrieval, Drew said efficiently that facilities coordination needed better oversight. He said it looking at the wall, the way he said most things. Sylvia did not respond. She wrote something in her margin. After the meeting, the nursing director, a careful woman named Claudette, who had survived longer than any director before her by knowing exactly what she did and did not know, asked Sylvia what she had written. The retrieval delay is caused by a process gap between two scheduling systems, Sylvia said. Not a staffing problem, not an oversight problem. I can map it and have a fix drafted by Thursday. Claudette looked at her for a moment. I'll need your direct manager's approval to include it in the operational report. I know, Sylvia said. I already emailed Ted, he replied while we were in the meeting. Claudette looked at her for another moment, this one slightly longer. Where were you before this? She asked. Sylvia smiled. Before this was a long time ago, she said, and went back to her clipboard. The incident that broke things open happened on a Wednesday in November, 5 weeks after that meeting. Drew Langford was finishing a shift that had gone badly in the small accumulating way that bad shifts go. Not one catastrophe, but a sequence of minor frictions that built pressure without an outlet. He had made a clinical decision that the attending had quietly reversed without discussion. He had been addressed incorrectly by a nurse he had previously corrected, and she had not apologized. He had received a message from his father about a fundraiser that he was required to attend on the same evening as a case he had been counting on to observe. He came around the corner of the west corridor carrying too much pressure and not enough outlet, and he found Sylvia Tran in the hallway with her cart, updating a supply manifest outside the family consultation room, where a family was in fact being consulted. He did not lower his voice. What are you doing outside this room right now? He said. Patients can hear that cart. Sylvia looked at him. I'm outside the room, she said. The cart is not making noise. Don't talk back to me. You're a facilities worker. Do your job somewhere else. She looked at him without expression for 2 seconds, which was 1 second longer than he was comfortable with. I'll finish the manifest at the station, she said. She turned her cart, Drew said, to the empty corridor, to no one in particular, except that there was a third-year resident named Ahmed standing 12 feet away who had not been noticed. These people act like they run the place. He walked away. Ahmed stood in the hallway for a moment with his coffee going cold. That evening, something else happened. A patient in post-op, recovering from a laparoscopic procedure, developed a reaction to a component in a supply product that had been substituted without notification during the recent shortage. The nursing team caught it quickly and managed it without escalation. But the substitution had been made informally, undocumented, during the supply crisis 3 weeks earlier. Nobody had formally cleared the substitution with clinical pharmacy. Sylvia had noted it at the time. She had flagged it in writing to the procurement coordinator with a recommendation that clinical pharmacy review the substitution before it went into standard rotation. The email had been received, acknowledged, and not acted on. The procurement coordinator's supervisor pulled the email chain the next morning. The flag was there. The timestamp was there. The recommendation was there. The conversation that followed did not involve Sylvia directly, but it involved the procurement coordinator, and then the supervisor, and then the clinical risk manager, and eventually, in a meeting nobody had called but everyone attended, the question became, who caught this and when? Brenna Calloway was in that meeting. She had not been invited, but she had information, so she stayed. She told the clinical risk manager about the supply crisis in September. She told them about the 40-minute resolution. She told them about the ventilation flag and the sterile processing error and the billing contract. Someone asked why none of those had appeared in any formal incident report. Because they were fixed before they became incidents, Brenna said. That's what she does. She fixes things before they need a report. The clinical risk manager, a deliberate man named Francis, who used words the way a carpenter uses nails, only when they would hold something, wrote something in his notebook and did not share it. Dr. Whitmore appeared in the facility's office the following Monday. She had not been there before, which was evident in how she stood in the doorway, as if the space had different rules. She asked to speak with Sylvia in the hallway. "There's been a complaint," Whitmore said, "from a resident, about your conduct in the West Corridor." Sylvia nodded. "I understand," she said. "He described an incident where you were obstructing access to a consultation room and responded in an insubordinate manner when redirected." Sylvia said nothing. "I have to take resident concerns seriously," Whitmore said. The tone was careful. "The way you speak to someone you are hoping will make a difficult conversation easier." "I understand," Sylvia said again. "Is there a formal process you need me to participate in?" Whitmore looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said. "There's a review. You'll be asked to provide your account of the incident." "Of course," Sylvia said. "I'll provide it in writing, if that's acceptable." Whitmore nodded and was already turning away, relieved, when Sylvia said, "I'd also like to include the email I sent to procurement on October 23rd, the one about the supply substitution. I want it on the record that I flagged it." Whitmore stopped. "Which email?" "The one with the recommendation that clinical pharmacy review the substitution before rotation. It was acknowledged and not acted on. The patient reaction last Wednesday came from that product. I want my flag documented in whatever review is happening." She said it the way Otis Foster might have said, "Floors are just slippery when you don't watch your step." Quiet, precise, carrying more weight than its syllables suggested. Whitmore said she would look into it and left. By Wednesday, there were two parallel processes running. One was Drew Langford's conduct complaint against a facilities coordinator. The other was a clinical risk review of a supply chain decision that had contributed to a patient reaction. And the paper trail of that review ran directly through a flagged email that a facilities coordinator had sent 3 weeks before the event. Drew did not know about the second process. His father did not know about the second process. Victoria Sterling, though she was not in this story, the shape she left was familiar, the shape of institutional protection moving to cover an expensive mistake. Ted Kapoor knew about both. He had worked at St. Clement's for 22 years, and he knew which processes ran parallel and what it meant when they did. He sat in his office on Wednesday afternoon with the door open and drank his coffee slowly. The review took 11 days. On the 12th day, Sylvia was called to a meeting in the clinical risk office. Francis, the risk manager, was there. Claudette, the nursing director, was there. The procurement supervisor was there. Drew Langford's name was not on the agenda. Francis opened the folder. He said, "Your flag on October 23rd is central to the timeline of this review. I want to understand the full context of that email." Sylvia provided it. All of it. The September supply crisis, the resolution, the product substitution, the flag, the recommendation, the non-response. Francis asked about her background. He asked in the neutral way of someone who had already found the answer and wanted to confirm it. She told him, not to perform, not to prove something, because the question was asked seriously and deserved a serious answer. The consulting work, the 12 years, the provincial committee testimony, the framework. Claudette stopped writing and looked up. Francis said, "Why didn't you disclose this when you joined facilities?" "Because I joined facilities," Sylvia said. "Not because I was hiding something. Because that's the job I applied for." The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a script stops being followed. The outcome arrived on a Friday in the form of a letter that Ted Kapoor hand-delivered to her desk, which was unusual. Ted did not deliver letters. He left them in the tray. He set the envelope down and stood there. "Read it now," he said. "I'll wait." She read it. The conduct complaint had been dismissed. The clinical risk review had identified a process failure in procurement follow-up and had recommended corrective action. Her name appeared in the report as the person who had identified and flagged the failure in advance. There was a second letter underneath. This one was from hospital administration. The Operational Integration Committee had a vacant project coordination role, a position created to bridge facilities, clinical and supply chain operations. The role had a salary. The role had a title. The role had been, for 3 months, sitting empty because no one could agree on what it required. The committee had agreed. Sylvia looked at the offer. She looked at Ted. He shrugged the way people shrug when something is not a surprise to them. I told them in September, he said. They needed to arrive at it themselves. Drew Langford was asked to attend a formal professional conduct review with the residency director. The review was not public. What came out of it was, by the accounts of 2 people who were present, direct. Dr. Whitmore had a way, when the institutional math changed, of arriving at clarity. Drew's father's assistant received no carbon copy this time. Drew did not come around the West Corridor for a while. When he did, he was quieter. Quieter is not the same as changed, but it is the start of something, if the person is willing to begin. Brina passed Sylvia in the hallway the Monday after the letters. She said, without stopping, "They finally read your resume." Sylvia said, "They read the email." Brenna said that's the same thing and kept walking. The new role began on the 1st of December. Sylvia moved into a shared office on the 2nd floor, closer to clinical operations. She kept one shelf of her old scheduling tools because some habits are structural, not sentimental. She could see the loading dock from the new window. She watched a facilities coordinator on the early shift making marks on a clipboard, and she recognized the pace. Not slow, not rushed. The pace of someone who understands that a floor read carefully is faster than one read quickly. On her second Tuesday in the role, she sat in the operational integration meeting in a chair at the table rather than one at the back. She brought a draft of the process map she had described to Claudette 6 weeks earlier. The supply retrieval delay was resolved by the end of the month. It had not required new staff or new oversight. It had required 2 scheduling systems to share one field of information that they had never been connected to share. The fix was 2 paragraphs long. The problem had been costing the hospital, by Francis's estimate, approximately 4 hours of nursing time per week for at least 3 years. Nobody celebrated it as a victory. It was just a problem that no longer existed. That's what good operational work looks like. It disappears into the baseline. Ahmed, the 3rd-year resident who had been standing in the hallway the day of the corridor incident, knocked on her office door in January with a question about a supply workflow he didn't understand. She answered it in full. When he left, he paused at the door and said, "I want you to know I heard what he said. In the hallway. I should have said something then." She looked at him for a moment. "You're saying it now," she said. "That counts." He nodded and left, and she went back to her work. Ted Kapoor retired in March. His farewell was a small thing in the break room, the kind of farewell a person chooses when they prefer their departure to be dignified rather than large. He shook hands with everyone. When he got to Sylvia, he said, "Don't fix things quietly forever. Make sure somebody sees it eventually." She said, "Somebody saw it." He said, "It almost wasn't somebody." She said, "I know." He left. She went back to the loading dock for one last walk of it, partly because she had a manifest to confirm and partly because it was where she had started, and some places deserve a proper goodbye. The facilities coordinator on the early shift looked up when she came in. He had heard the story by then, in the way hospital stories travel, incompletely, accurately in the details that mattered. He said, "Is it true you fixed the retrieval delay in 2 paragraphs?" She said, "The fix was 2 paragraphs. The understanding took 3 years." He thought about that for a moment and went back to his clipboard. The loading dock smelled the same, industrial soap and cold air, and the particular quiet of a building that was already running at 5 a.m. before anyone arrived to notice. She made her last mark on the sheet and handed it to him. Here's what stays with me about Sylvia Tran, and why I'm telling you this. For 11 years, an accomplished woman mopped logistical floors that nobody saw. She fixed problems before they had names. She flagged failures before they had consequences. She did it without a plaque, without a title, without the parking spot that used to have her name on a sign. And the thing that made her visible was not her excellence. She had been excellent for 11 years in a gray vest in a basement office. What made her visible was a complaint. Someone tried to use institutional weight to diminish her, and in doing so, opened a process that had no choice but to look at the full picture. That's not a satisfying origin story. It's an honest one. There are people like Sylvia in every building you walk through. At the desk you pass without looking up. On the other end of the hold music, wearing the vest with the name patch you have never read. The question this story leaves behind is not whether you would recognize a Sylvia in a courtroom. It's whether you would recognize one in a hallway on a Tuesday before anything had happened yet. Tell us in the comments. And if you know someone who carries more than their job title suggests, share this with them. They might need to hear that what they've built quietly still stands, whether or not anyone has counted it yet.